Hello, everyone. This is Ellen Armentrout, attorney in Husch Blackwell's Higher Education Group. We're excited today to give you the presentation on the legal landscape for Greek life issues in higher education. Before we begin, I would like to cover a few housekeeping items. At the bottom of your audience console are multiple application icons for your use during the program today. If you have any questions during the webcast, please submit your questions via the question box. We will try to answer all questions during the webcast today, but if a fuller answer is needed or we run out of time, it will be answered later via email. We truly appreciate audience participation and encourage you to submit questions. If you have any technical difficulty, please click on the Help icon. It has a question mark and provides information regarding common technical issues. A copy of today's slide deck is available in the resource list icon that looks like a folder at the bottom of your screen. This program has been approved for Colorado, Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, Missouri, Nebraska, Tennessee, and Texas continuing legal education credit. Wisconsin credit is pending. To report your hours in Illinois, Indiana, Nebraska, Tennessee, or Texas, click on the CLE widget at the bottom of your screen and complete the questions. A recording of the webcast will be available tomorrow for watching and sharing. Once available, a link to the recording will be emailed to you along with a certificate of attendance. The recording will be available for 2 weeks. Joining me today is Scott Schneider. Scott assists education entities with complex legal issues, including particularly sensitive matters like institutional response to sexual assault. He's a prominent litigator as well as a sought-after advisor on Title IX, training programs, faculty hiring, promotion and tenure, and risk management within student affairs. So we're going to begin our presentation with a little bit of information about a handful of cases that we think are either emblematic of trends that we see in this line of case law or interesting new developments that we think raise some novel issues in the context of Greek life. Then Scott is going to take over and talk a little bit about risk and risk management for those of you handling these issues on your campuses. So the first question we ask is, does the university have a duty to a student who is injured in connection with a fraternity or sorority activity? Sometimes the answer is yes, and sometimes the answer is no. In the first case I'm going to talk about, Furyk versus the University of Delaware, the answer is yes. This case is emblematic of cases where courts have found a duty owed by the university. In this particular case, Mr. Furyk, who was a student on the football team, decided in the fall of his sophomore year to join a fraternity. During a hazing event, a member of the fraternity he was pledging poured a lye-based oven cleaner on Mr. Furyk, resulting in his being burned and permanently scarred. In this case, where the court found no duty, the court reiterated what we all know, that the university no longer stands in loco parentis to its students. However, the court stated that the university has a duty to regulate and supervise foreseeable and dangerous activities occurring on its property, including the negligent or intentional acts of third parties in those instances where it exercises control. The court's decision was based on the fact that the university knew about and repeatedly emphasized the university's policy against hazing. There had been other hazing incidents on campus. There had been meetings with fraternity representatives to talk about the hazing that was going on. There had been hazing incidents on with regard to the particular fraternity that was being pledged by Mr. Furyk. And there had been public pronouncements and warnings on campus about hazing behavior that the court said resulted in no changes on campus. As a result, there was an assumed duty that the school owes the student. And as the court described it, the assumed duty was an indispensable part of the bundle of services which colleges afford their students. So the next case I'm going to talk about, Yost versus Wabash College, is another state law case, similar facts, that came to the opposite conclusion about whether or not the university owed a duty. In this case, another student was injured in a hazing incident on campus as part of a fraternity event. In this case, the court held that the injury occurred in an area controlled by the fraternity, even though the college had some access to the fraternity house, and thus the duty to the student was owed by the fraternity as the landlord and not the college. Contrary to the court in Furyk, the Yost court determined that the college's actions, drafting policies against hazing, implementing procedures, conducting other investigations, and imposing discipline, did not result in an assumed duty to the student. Finally, the court determined that there was no agency relationship between the fraternity and the college. The fraternity was not acting on the college's behalf. The court said that mere consent to governance does not equate to agency, and therefore the college could not be held vicariously liable for the behavior of the fraternity. So two similar sets of facts and two very different outcomes. A little later, Scott will talk to you about how you can best mitigate your risk when it seems that some of the same actions result in very different outcomes in these state law cases. Now, we're going to turn our attention to two very different cases involving fraternities and sororities that we wonder if may be indicative of a trend in future cases. The first involves a hazing incident, but the case isn't presented as a traditional hazing occurred, does the university owe the student a duty type of case. Instead, in Groover versus LSU, the plaintiffs alleged that the student's death as a result of hazing amounted to discrimination on the part of the university. After Max Groover died tragically as a result of a, quote, fraternity-related hazing incident, unquote, his parents sued the university claiming a violation of Title IX. LSU filed a motion to dismiss. The Groovers allege that participation in Greek life is encouraged at LSU, that the policy against hazing is enforced against sororities, but not against the male students in fraternities. Thus, male students in fraternities face a risk of serious injury and death. There's a long history of male students pledging LSU-recognized fraternities who have died or been injured, and as a result, sororities have almost no hazing, while in fraternities, hazing of fraternity pledges was described as rampant. The court denied LSU's motion to dismiss. The court said that actual notice and indifference are not required for the university to face liability, and a jury could infer heightened risk to male students based on LSU's existing policies. Now, we don't know what's going to happen when this case actually moves forward, but it's an interesting turn of events here with regard to Title IX. In a similar sort of case, also very recent, as you can see, August of 2019, this was a case involving fraternities and sororities and allegations of sex discrimination, although perhaps not the type of allegations that you may be expecting. In 2016, Harvard University enacted a policy of not allowing members of unrecognized single-sex organizations to hold leadership positions in recognized student organizations or athletic teams, or receive college-administered fellowships. These college-administered fellowships include Rhodes Scholarships, Marshall Scholarships, and Mitchell Scholarships. So you can see that this would be particularly disturbing to students who had become members of or wanted to become members of unrecognized single-sex organizations, unrecognized by the university. Several of these unrecognized single-sex organizations, which are fraternities and sororities, as well as 3 students, filed suit against Harvard University, alleging that the policy amounts to discrimination on the basis of sex. They said that they were forced to forego valuable leadership and postgraduate opportunities, which can impact future professional opportunities. The court used the employment context as a model and found that the plaintiff alleged plausible claims of violation of Title IX under all 3 of the disparate treatment tests. Under the but-for test, the court found the policy as applied to any individual draws distinctions based on sex. Under the association test, the court found the policy can only be applied to a particular student after analyzing the sex of the students in the organization with which the student seeks to associate. And under the stereotyping test, the court found that Harvard's purported ideal of the modern man or woman is informed by stereotypes about how men and women should act. In addition, because of some statements made by the university, the court found that the plaintiffs alleged facts sufficient to state a plausible claim under a theory of anti-male bias. The all-male final clubs on campus, the university is described as promoting sexual violence, misogyny, and bigotry. As a result, Harvard's motion to dismiss was denied. Again, this is a situation where we don't exactly know what's going to happen as the case moves forward, but it raises interesting questions about sort of a new wave of issues presented by Greek life on campus. So that's a summary of some of the more interesting and some very recent cases. Now we're going to switch gears a little bit, and Scott is going to talk about the takeaway from these cases and what schools should do moving forward.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Ellen, for that. And I'm working remotely from Houston, Texas, so it is warm here, and looking forward to spending a little bit of time with you, and hopefully having some time at the end to address any questions. So, I'll give you what I consider sort of the summary of the state law in this setting. That when we talk about duties, and I think the 2 cases Ellen talked about right up front illustrates this in a fairly profound way, that first off, different states have very different views about what are institutional duties vis-a-vis off-campus conduct, all of that sort of stuff. So one of the things when we're developing a risk management protocol for the university's relationship with Greek life organizations is to really know what is the state law here. What is it that courts have said in the past regarding do we have a duty, under what set of circumstances, even if we don't have a duty to intervene, have we assumed a duty? And generally speaking, and you sort of get that flavor from those opening slides as well, even within state law, it's very, very context specific. So when we're developing risk management protocols and plans around these areas, having an understanding of, well, what are the operating laws in our particular state here. This last part, and I underlined it, is also being mindful of the fact that duties, especially between the obligations of universities with respect to their students, are in a state of probably 5 decades of evolution at this point, where I think it is fair to say, although there are some outlier cases going the other way, that from a tort perspective, from a judicial perspective, more is expected of universities now than, frankly, ever before. And so, there may be cases, for instance, in your particular jurisdiction that go back 20 years and say, you don't have any duties when it comes to off-campus misconduct committed by fraternities, but there's certainly been an evolution in the way courts view that relationship between universities and its students. It has certainly evolved, and I think it is fair to say that more now is expected. Ellen alluded to this. This is bullet point number 2. In this space, no good deed goes unpunished. So even if there are court decisions in your jurisdiction saying no duty under negligence law to intervene, we can assume those duties voluntarily by the acts of intervention that we engage in. So in some ways, our attempts maybe to manage hazing or manage binge drinking and things like that may create, without any, frankly, case law support, we may be assuming duty that we did not have but for those interventions, and so being mindful of that. I think the Groover case is it's significant in the sense that what we're seeing nationally are more and more creative applications of Title IX in a variety of different contexts. And here, we see that application, I think, frankly, for one of the first times in the context of hazing. Now, what the Groovers did was just survived a motion to dismiss, a 12b6 motion. They're going to, I suspect, have a very difficult time summoning sufficient facts to survive ultimately a motion for summary judgment. But what they found is a hook, at least to get into what will undoubtedly be potentially very expensive discovery. And so we're seeing more and more novel applications of Title IX in a variety of different contexts, but I think the Groover case is an interesting one, connecting it to this work with respect to hazing and Greek life. And then I think this Harvard case at the end, Harvard was trying to intervene in a way to manage risk within their Greek life operation and minimize, frankly, the importance of Greek life on campus. This was an intervention that they had come up with. And at least at the district court level, the court was saying, look, we're not comfortable with this. In fact, we think this approach violates Title IX. There are also associational reasons for our public institution friends, where some interventions that might work at a small private school, like shutting down Greek life, are not going to work at a large public institution. So with that as backdrop, what I'd like to talk about is less law and more practical stuff. Generally speaking, when we think about risk management within the context of Greek life and the university setting, what are some of the best practices? The schools that are doing this well, what are some of the common features of that? And I'll point you to a number of really good resources that are in the public domain that I feel are really, really strongly about. When we talk about risk management in Greek life, there are really 4 areas, and that's what I'll focus on this afternoon. The first one is with respect to binge drinking interventions. The second is with respect to emerging practices regarding hazing. What are some best practices to minimize the incidence rate of hazing, and then also to distance ourselves as an institution as much as possible from the independent acts of bad actors. Number 3 is something I like to dub, and we'll get into it as I talk about what is going on at the University of Virginia, clarifying or having clarity about what the relationship is between the university and its Greek life organizations. And then the last piece that I'll talk about this afternoon are just some of the basics, shoring up kind of basic compliance functions so that we don't unwittingly open our institutions up to significant liability nightmares. And so I'll go through each one of these component parts, and I think if you put all of them together at your institutions, what you will have is about as robust of a plan to, number one, bring down incidence rates of binge drinking, bring down hazing incidence rates as well, while also at the same time managing litigation risk as well. I will start with some studies. All of these are online, and the two I have right here stand for a couple of what I think are fairly unremarkable propositions. But nevertheless, you know, when we say things sometimes about Greek life, there are a number of cliches that we operate from. Some are informed by actual data and studies. Some are biases and uninformed by any data. But there is pretty clear evidence in study upon study that heavy drinking, binge drinking, and Greek life correlate fairly close together. That if you're in, especially a fraternity, that you're considerably more likely than any other student on campus to engage in binge drinking activities. And if you want to read what I think is probably one of the better articles on this, it's that first article right there, Heavy Drinking in College Students, Who is at Risk and What is Being Done About It. And again, you can find that online. It's right there. The second article that I've pulled is an article called The Adverse Impact of Heavy Episodic Drinkers on Other College Students. I think both anecdotally and from a study perspective, it's very clear that when students engage in binge drinking activities, they are at risk of harm to themselves, both in terms of impairments associated with drinking too much, whether it's alcohol poisoning, whether it's you're so impaired that you accidentally walk off the balcony of a second-story residence hall, that you get into a car and drive intoxicated and maybe run into something and hurt yourself. But what this article focuses on is not just self-harm associated with binge drinking, but that when we are in a setting where there are binge drinkers, that there is a high risk that others who aren't impaired are going to be injured by their misbehavior. And again, I don't think either one of those studies are remarkable, but they certainly confirm to a large extent, especially that first article, the cliche about Greek life, that we have a very special problem when it comes to binge drinking within the context of Greek life. Really interesting studies about, is it Greek life that turns, let's say, people without drinking problems into heavy drinkers? Studies that go different ways. I think the most compelling argument is binge drinkers or people with alcohol problems tend to self-select for fraternity participation, but I won't get too far into the weeds with that. I'm going to go into some different places here. I'm going to start with, I think the timing is good for a little conversation about Richard Nixon. So in the 1970s, Richard Nixon launches, in part, what would become dubbed the war on drugs. And rhetorically, in the early 1970s, late 1960s, I was very much focused on what was happening on campus communities. in the mid-1980s. That rhetoric that Richard Nixon started during his presidency led to something called the Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act of 1986. When the Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act was passed in 1986, the focus of that bill was in essence for the government to provide institutions with grant funding to study how do we reduce the incidence rate of alcohol abuse and drug abuse on college campuses. All right, so that was the initial drive behind the Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act. In 1989, though, we have William Bennett becomes Secretary of Education. He was also the first drug czar that we had ever had. And long story short, in 1989, for the first time, he connected institutional compliance obligations with complying with the Drug-Free School and Communities Act. And generally speaking, what he said, or what the law said in 1989 and continues to say to this day, is that institutions of higher education which receive federal funds or financial assistance, which is almost all of us, must develop and implement a program to prevent the unlawful possession, use, or distribution of drugs and alcohol by students and employees. So one of our requirements under DFSCA is to develop those sorts of policies. The second part is that we are on an annual basis supposed to notify our community about those policies. The more significant portion of that law, I think for purposes of today's conversation, in addition to having these policies and plans, is on a biennial basis, what we are supposed to be doing is looking at our plans to bring down the incidence rates of drug and alcohol abuse to see, are these effective? Is what we're doing, what are our goals here? What are we doing in terms of programs to meet those goals? And then measuring the effectiveness of those goals. And I can tell you, I think to more formally connect this compliance obligation to the presentation at hand, when schools are being thoughtful in this space, almost invariably a big portion, a significant portion of their planning focuses on the activities of Greek life, bringing incidents, coming up with measurables with respect to Greek life and incidence abuse, substance abuse, and then on at least 2-year basis, monitoring the effectiveness of those programs. And more importantly, when whatever intervention we're trying isn't making an impact, taking that biennial review process seriously and saying, let's start adjusting our policies and programs. And so, look, the advantage of what I'll talk about in a second is that if we implement these sorts of practices, number one, I suspect there's a chance that we could moderate or bring in, lower the incidence rates of drug and alcohol abuse and binge drinking on our campus, which has all sorts of wonderful side effects. But the other secondary consideration here is if we do these things, we're also complying with the Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act. With that as backdrop, what I want to talk about now is, again, not very legal, but very, very practical. And again, this is from going to schools, working with schools that I think do this stuff well. How do they develop alcohol prevention programs? And there are 3 pieces of research here that if you're designing these sorts of programs and want to be, in line with best practices, that I think should inform the way you're doing this. This first one is, and again, all of this is online. If you can't get them, send me an email. I'm happy to send you the underlying research. The first one is this article, A Typology for Campus-Based Alcohol Prevention, Moving Toward Environmental Management Strategies. And what this article basically does is identifies all of the potential causes of binge drinking, then talks about, summarizes the research about, well, what are effective strategies for different problems, summarizes that research, and then says, here's what's working, here's potentially what isn't working or needs more testing, and things like that. And so when we're developing our strategic interventions to lower incidence rate down, it's not something that a group of people that haven't studied this issue should be spitballing. This should be informed by the ton of research out there on, number one, what are the causes, and number two, what are the effective interventions. Again, I think this article does a fantastic job of summarizing the state of the research and providing really clear and helpful guidance to institutions about, well, what are successful interventions? What are best practice interventions? Same thing with this next article, Identification, Prevention, and Treatment, a review of individual-focused strategies to reduce problematic alcohol consumption by college students. Very similar to the other piece that I mentioned a moment ago. Identifies a number of intervention strategies, when they would be appropriate, and then does a summary of, in essence, where has this worked, under what set of circumstances, et cetera. One more piece, and then I'll transition out of this. And that's this one, Social Norms and the Prevention of Alcohol Misuse in Collegiate Context. Again, rather than, and I hate putting it this way, rather than us just sitting around at a table and trying to, brainstorm what would work, when we are developing programs and policies with respect to minimizing or reducing the incidence rate of binge drinking, what we would like those programs to be based on is the research in this space about what is effective and what isn't effective. And when it comes to alcohol abuse, there is considerable research out there about what are effective strategic intervention strategies. Those three articles do a great job of laying those out. And so I highly recommend, if you're in the midst of developing that sort of program, that you at least review those articles. I'm also a big fan of free riding to an extent on the hard work that has been done by other institutions in this space. And I'm not going to pick on a school or anything like that. I mean, different schools have significant hazing problems. Some are a little more open and willing to admit it. One of those is at Dartmouth University. There was a really interesting article, a profile about the hazing practices at Dartmouth. I think this was in 2014. This is it. In Newsweek, that really got the attention of the administration, President Scanlon at Dartmouth, and what they developed was a program called Moving Dartmouth Forward, all right? And the goal of the program, and again, they have a website you can go on, super transparent about what their goals were, where they are in terms of their implementation timeline, some assessments and evaluations about what is working, what isn't working. But as far as I can tell, this was a robust effort by Dartmouth to try to minimize the abuses, whether it's binge drinking and the impact that has on the binge drinker and others on campus, to minimize the incidence rate of hazing. This was this robust effort to change culture in a fundamental way. And I would highly recommend, if you are developing a program along these lines, to take a look at what they've put on the website. Again, Moving Dartmouth Forward. There is tons of material that they've been very, very transparent about sharing. one of the big things, or some of the big things, three of the big things that President, I almost said, I don't know what that was, but President Scanlon recommended, and rules that are part of this Move Dartmouth Forward campaign are that they have effectively prohibited hard alcohol on campus. So we're talking about anything other than beer and wine on campus would be a code of conduct violation under their student code. If a fraternity, a Greek life organization, a sorority is hosting a social event, one of the things Dartmouth now requires is that the Greek life organization provide security and bartenders for those events. The security then presumably are empowered to intervene in situations that they think are getting out of control, and the same thing with bartenders, that they presumably are empowered to cut people off when they think, wow, you've had way too much to drink. The other thing that Dartmouth did, and we've seen different approaches to this particular issue about rush and delaying rush at various institutions. But here at Dartmouth, for the first 6 weeks of the fall term, first-year students are prohibited from attending any sort of Greek event. At other schools, we've seen that ban extend as far as a full academic year. So that's one of the interventions a number of schools have identified. When we look at, again, data points for, I'm going to switch from binge drinking a little bit now to hazing, which is, again, one of those, of the four things I said right up front that I wanted to cover, where we're seeing litigation activity and questions about what are schools' duties vis-a-vis their students who are acting off campus. It's almost invariably, that issue is almost invariably coming up within the context of a case where a student was hazed. And here, there's data points on this, that this is not some unfounded cliche that Greek life has a particular problem with hazing. You see, within varsity athletics, there may be an even bigger problem. But for fraternities and sororities in this 2008 study, the percent of students that experienced hazing that were in Greek life was 73%. That despite the fact that, at least in most states, hazing is illegal and can send you to jail, and despite the fact that every university in the country, from a conduct perspective, prohibits hazing. So 73% of Greek members said, despite that, we're still experiencing hazing. I literally have, this is a shout out, I don't even think she's listening, I have literally the greatest associate attorney in America. No one can fight me on this. Paige Duggins-Clay, she is my colleague in Austin. She's the most wonderful associate higher ed attorney I've ever worked with. But I asked her, I said, Paige, we were talking about this presentation and some work we're doing for a client. I said, can you do a study and tell me, are there intervention strategies out there with respect to bringing hazing rates down, because this is an unacceptable number, that have been studied and proven to be effective. And the great associate that she is, she came back and she said, there's really nothing out there that's demonstrably worked to reduce hazing incidence rates. I then DM'd one of my favorite Twitter followers, and that's President Walter Kimbrough at fantastic Dillard University, who's also an expert on hazing, and asked him pretty much the same question. And he gave me the same fairly pessimistic response. With that said, I do want to point out some really wonderful work that has been done in this space, which I, again, think can inform our prevention methods and programs on campus. And that is from my friends who I think are on this call or this webinar that has been done by the Stop Hazing Coalition, which is in partnership with the Cleary Center. I highly recommend, if you're in the process of reviewing your programs and practices to reduce the incidence rate of hazing, I highly recommend that you take a look at this report, which I have taken some generous chunks of here and pasted on this slide. We Don't Haze, a companion prevention brief for college and university professionals. It does a fantastic job of laying out the problems, the incidence rate, all that sort of stuff, and then talking about what does effective prevention in this space look like. Also, it does a great job, I think it's 10 pages, of discussing what are some emerging practices that schools have engaged in with an eye towards reducing incidence rate, and how are those working. I highly, highly recommend this piece. It is online, it's accessible, it's in the public domain. My understanding is that this is all part of a hazing prevention consortium, which is made up of a number of just fantastic schools, Cornell, our friends at Texas A&M, the University of Arizona, Central Florida, I think Kentucky, Virginia, et cetera. But one of the big picture takeaways from this report is that for you to have an effective hazing program, there has to be different layers to it. That you only get significant changes by having comprehensive prevention efforts that address the issue of hazing at multiple levels and through diverse strategies. They are a big believer in doing, I think, what I talked about with respect to the biennial report, getting a group of different people together to talk about what's working, what isn't working from different constituencies on campus. They are a big fan of doing the same thing when it comes to hazing. And you see this clipped piece I have on the far right. It talks about what a campus hazing prevention team might look like, and it's cross-disciplinary. It's people with very different perspectives on this. They also have, and again, I don't have time to go into it in great detail, but I've cut a piece from the report, the strategic prevention framework. What does a broad, multi-layered framework to address hazing, what does that look like, generally speaking, and then filling in some of the gaps with information about interventions that at some schools they're using and at some schools have been tested and appear to look like they may be potentially effective. Same thing, I alluded to this a second ago, there is this wonderful list in this piece about emerging strategies for hazing prevention. I think there are about 15 that they come up with, one of which is, and again, it's multi-layered, visible campus leadership on this issue, statements, making it a priority. Think of what President Scanlon has done at Dartmouth as sort of an example of that. That we look at our policy and protocol reviews for reporting hazing and how do we respond to hazing. Engaging in sophisticated social norms messaging. Engaging in something that we've become acutely aware of in the Title IX world, which is bystander intervention, and also developing not just check-the-box compliance and training programs, but training programs that are designed to actually change behavior. And what they allude to in this article is that the choice of presenter, when doing that, becomes super important. And not just that, but constant dosage amounts of the training so that people don't forget about it 2 weeks after the training is done. Again, I can't summarize it all in a minute or 2 minutes. I highly recommend that you take a look at this program. Last piece here is I'll give some credit. Again, I'm a big believer on free riding to an extent. I'll give my friends at the University of Texas system right down the street from my normal office a shout out here. In 2014, they did a comprehensive review of hazing and alcohol incidents and their practices and policies and all that. Again, in the public domain. Worth a look. It is very thoughtful, very intentional. And you can see some of the things that they talk about in terms of fixing the problems or addressing the problems on a go forward are captured in these bullet points and are very similar to what we saw from the consortium model as well. One clear developing best practice in this space, and I feel like everybody is on board with this, and I'm sorry, I just did a Google search, and Vanderbilt's was the first one that came up, but I know a number of schools have this, is that we have what's called an anti-hazing hotline of some form, where students who are experiencing problems or third parties who are having problems can come forward in a confidential way and make a report to a hazing hotline, which would then, of course, we want to monitor this and make sure, once we get these reports in, that we're handling them appropriately. But again, this, I think, is a well-established best practice at this point. To have the hotline, number one, and to regularly communicate about the existence of the hotline, not only to students, not only to employees involved in Greek life, but also to family members as part of parents' orientation, et cetera. And it's just not enough to have the hotline. I know this doesn't need to be said or shouldn't need to be said, but when we have a hotline like this, ensuring that calls that go in are handled in an appropriate way. I want to spend the last couple of minutes that I have talking about some other practical issues that I alluded to right on the front end of this call. There was really interesting developments out at the University of Virginia. I think this was about 5 years ago around safety rules at University of Virginia fraternity parties, a lot of coverage of this by the Washington Post and other media outlets. And so one of the things that was super interesting, and again, online in the public domain, worth a look, is what the University of Virginia did is they drafted a brand new fraternal organization agreement. And there's so much I love about this, and I think it's super interesting. It's online, you could find it. I'll pick out some of my favorite provisions from this. But what this agreement is designed to do in part is define in a very real way, and also, frankly, I think, and nobody from UVA has told me this, but this is my read, in a way that's designed to manage risk for the institution, define what is the relationship between the university and your organization, all right? And here, I'll pull out some of my favorite provisions, and of course, I don't have my glasses, so it's going to be virtually impossible for me to read this, but I'll try nonetheless. This great line in the definitions and purpose. The university does not use the concept of recognizing fraternal organizations. So that's like already something that I find super interesting, and again, worth a more extensive conversation about. These organizations are free to exist independent of this agreement. Fraternal organizations enter into this agreement to seek certain benefits from the university, including a system of support and accountability. The purpose of this agreement is to describe the entire relationship. We go on. This is, again, one of my favorite provisions, and I think I have 3 or 4 of these. I won't bore you to tears without reading all of them, but just to give you a flavor. The university is a public corporation, and the fraternal organization is not part of that corporation, but rather exists and operates independently of the university. We agree that you're not an agent, employee, servant of the university, and we don't have the authority to act for the other or commit the other to any activity, blah, blah, blah. The university does not supervise, direct, or control the fraternal organization's activities, on and on and on. And why do I think they're putting this in there? To be able to argue if something goes horribly wrong down the line and someone is hurt. We haven't assumed any duty to intervene on your behalf. You are grown-up people entering an organization which you would be free to enter without any intervention for us. Just don't look to us from a liability perspective if something goes horribly wrong. Along the same lines, you see dealing with third parties. They require, UVA requires that you'll see in this italicized language, as one of such steps, the fraternal organization shall, without exception, include the following statement: in the fraternal organization's correspondence, messages, contracts, publications, and other such written or internet communications, blah, blah, blah. Although this organization has members who are University of Virginia students and may have employees, the organization is not a part or an agency of the university. I mean, we're beating this issue down, setting clarity about what the relationship is between the school and the fraternal organization over and over and over again. Lastly, there is obviously this piece where we try to say, hey, look, from a liability perspective, we want you to indemnify us. And oh, by the way, it's not just enough for you to agree to indemnify us for any harms or things like that. We want to make sure that you have sufficient insurance in place to cover any indemnity obligation that you have. And so, again, I think this is a wonderful template if we're trying to figure out what is the relationship between the university and our Greek organizations, that we not get sucked up into thinking about things that we have historically, thinking about this relationship in the way that we have historically thought of it. We recognize this group. I don't even know at this point that is a meaningful term in this space. And you see this agreement serves, I think, as a really interesting template agreement to start perhaps rethinking, well, what is the relationship between the university and these Greek organizations? How can we define it and frankly limit it so that we can manage institutional risk associated with Greek life? I'll close with just a couple of sort of basic things for schools that lease on-campus houses to Greek organizations. I can't stress enough the importance, and there have been cases upon cases, and you can look in the UE, for instance, large risk reports that they do. Cases upon cases where what is contained in the lease agreement becomes absolutely mission critical in assessing liability and who's on the hook as well. And so when we think of lease agreements, these are the things that typically we want to make sure that these lease agreements are covering these issues in a way that's favorable to the institutions and reflective of reality, that there are risk allocation provisions, indemnification provisions. You also need to look if we are relying on insurance from a national organization or a local organization. We want to take a really good close look. This is not my area of expertise about what are some of the exclusions in that general liability policy. Who has responsibility for maintenance of the house? Who's responsible for repairing the house in that property? And then if for some reason we say, hey, from a disciplinary standpoint, we are shutting this fraternity down, you can't be on campus anymore, you cannot do any events anymore, and if you do and we find out about it, you run the risk of being disciplined, that we at the same time in our lease have the right to immediately cancel that lease agreement with that fraternity. The last piece is, again, this is basics, and I know I'm running out of time, but fortunately it's the last slide. If you're going to be providing any degree of oversight over events, for instance, you say one of our requirements is if you're going to have a Greek event, that you have to fill out a registration of some form and agree to certain things. if you're going to take that ownership over Greek life issues, any sort of degree of oversight, then you need to provide oversight over the event, all right? We don't do these things to just go through the motions of doing them. Having a fraternity organization fill out some sort of registration form merely to satisfy some bureaucratic response or necessity may be getting us to that point where we have, if we didn't have a duty to them, now may have assumed a duty. So if we decide, hey, we're going to exercise a degree of oversight, then we need to exercise that degree of oversight. Same sort of thing. And if, for instance, we say we want a staff member from our Greek organizations to attend events, well, then they need to be prepared to meaningfully supervise that event. Number two, when we get these calls about hazing activity and we're on notice of problematic behavior, it triggers an obligation on our part to intervene. And I can tell you from experience, and I've said this many times before, I've been involved in hazing-related investigations. I know how enormously frustrating those can be, but when we are aware of information, this is very basic, where we have a concern about student safety, it is absolutely essential for us to respond appropriately to whatever the information is. Lastly is, and this is part of a national trend, we just enhanced some legislation in Texas about this, is I think a developing best practice is when we're having ongoing concerns about Greek organizations and discipline, that we publish, that we disclose to potential incoming students what are the disciplinary actions that have been taken against Greek organizations over some period of time. Obviously, we don't want to do that in a way that would violate FERPA, but the notion here is that in making a decision about which organization, Greek organization to pledge to, that decision should be informed, and it should be informed by sort of the same rationale under the Clery Act, should be informed by, are there reasons where we think there is some risk concern here? And certainly to the extent that we have serial violators of our hazing policy that continue to recruit for active members, that we should be notifying potential members, people who are prospective members, about potential risks associated with that so that they can make informed decisions. And again, in some states, there's a push, including in Texas, to make that a statutory requirement, and in Texas, at some level, it is. And so it was right on time and only had one significant technical glitch, but that's the end of that material. Ellen?
Well, it looks like we might have time for some questions. If you're willing, maybe we can get one question in. Does that sound all right, Scott, to you?
Yeah, sure.
Okie doke. So one of the questions we've got is, we've seen some institutions unrecognizing Greek organizations entirely. Does this release the institution from liability?
Yeah, so again, this is going to depend on state law, and it's going to depend on context. And so it's hard to answer that question in the abstract. I think generally speaking, when we say, hey, this is a problematic Greek life organization, and we're no longer going to recognize you on our campus as an entity that gets the support of the institution. My only concern would come up in the context of they've been, and we say, oh, by the way, if you have events, we will discipline you. That's number one. Or if you continue with this organization, we will discipline you. My only concern comes up to the extent that we become aware of the unrecognized group continuing to participate in activities and we don't do what we say we were going to do. That would be my primary concern in that space. Ellen, I don't know if you had any thoughts about that, but those were mine.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. We're getting some other questions which I think are similar, where the university doesn't the Greek organizations either aren't on campus or you don't have any control over them at all. And I think it's going to be the same sort of analysis, a case-by-case, state-specific analysis of what the responsibilities are. Would you agree?
Yeah, look, it's the liability will be for negligence law, which is always very state-specific, and there's a ton of cases in different states, and you sort of hit on the two main ones that come to very different conclusions on sometimes similar facts. So you're going to have to take a look at your state law. And I would say, I think in the majority of states, they don't recognize a duty in this space, but even within those states, there are things that we can do where our good deeds don't go unpunished, where we try to intervene, and, oh, by the way, we end up immersing ourselves in a duty under negligence law. So also being mindful of, we might not have a duty, but under what set of circumstances will we assume a duty?
Great. All right, well, we are now over our time, so I'm going to wrap this up. Thank you all for joining us for our program today. We hope that the information provided was helpful for you and your organization. If you have not already, please click on the survey icon at the bottom of your screen to complete our short survey. Your feedback assists us in providing quality future programs. As a reminder, this program has been approved for Colorado, Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, Missouri, Nebraska, Tennessee, and Texas continuing legal education credit. Wisconsin credit is still pending. A recording of the webcast will be available tomorrow for watching and sharing. Once available, a link to the recording will be emailed to you along with a certificate of attendance. The recording will be available for 2 weeks. This concludes our webinar. Thank you.